stories trumps pretty much anything else when it comes down to trying to convey, convince, enroll, engage your audience. Eventually, I started sharing my personal story as to why I joined November, why I wanted to launch the foundation, and linking my personal story to the organizational story and also its purpose and mission was just a recipe for success. I went on to raise 2.8 million euros with our team, got 110,000 people to sign up. So stories can be your secret weapon. Stories can be your USB, but they can also make it fun for anybody here who's listening, who hates sales.
If I'm the kind of agency that's got an amazing show reel, I've got all of these awards, I've got all these amazing clients, but every time I showcase something, I'm showcasing the end product. Where do I start from switching that into really powerful customer stories that will attract more of those kind of clients?
So
wouldn't it be nice if you could attract your ideal clients without having to send hundreds of proposals or spend hours on sales calls? In today's episode, I'm chatting with Mark Leruste, who is the king of story selling. Mark's TED Talk entitled "What They Don't Tell You About Entrepreneurship" has been viewed over 1 million times. He regularly gets paid 5-figure sums to speak for blue chip clients like Nike, Google, and Adobe. In this episode, Mark shares how to use your story to attract your dream clients and get the upper hand in your next creative pitch. He also walks us through a 3-step framework that you can use to transform your portfolio into a client-getting machine. I'm really confident that you're going to get value from this. I pushed Mark hard on all of his knowledge and I squeezed out the juiciest parts. As always, if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend and make sure to hit that subscribe button. Mark, I was just checking out your website and you now have a big tagline that says, "Connect with anyone, the art of storytelling, connection, and building trust." Can you just talk a little bit about the relationship between storytelling and being able to connect with people?
If you think about back in the ancient days, right? Like when we sort of started to discover fire and cook food, our larynx lengthened and we started talking more, and the day extended into the night. And I never know how anthropologists know this, but they estimate that up to 80% of conversations around the fire were sharing stories. Now, it sort of makes sense when you think about it, because odds are most people would share stories around things like what berries to avoid, how to catch prey, how to avoid predators, how to find shelter. So literally our ability to survive and thrive depended on our ability to share and pay attention to stories. And then if you look at sort of civilization throughout history, we've always tried to find ways to capture stories, to share. And you could use the word connect. You could also use the word share. From the ancient sort of caves you have in France where they've got pictures of the hunting of bisons or whatever that were, mammoths, whatever they were trying to get, to ancient Egypt with hieroglyphics. And I don't know why they're always like 2Ds, but anyway, that's another story. But from rituals and beliefs and afterlife and all this kind of stuff. And then, I don't want to get, sort of controversial here, but whatever your religious views are, if you look at most religion, right? If you look at most religion, especially scriptures, Bibles, the Quran, that kind of stuff, it tends to be values wrapped up in stories. It tends to be sort of like, here are beliefs, here are values, here's how we do things, and let us tell you some stories so that they stick. And so very much storytelling is a native language. And now most people can get on board with that, but why is it that it's specifically interesting for people listening to this in terms of their leadership capacity or building their business or growing their audience? They actually, Uri Harrison did a study at Princeton where he looked at MRI scans of brains of people who were sharing stories and people who are listening to stories. And if you look at the sort of the image of the brain scan, the MRI scan, what you'll see is that as they start this experiment, the brain waves and activities are quite dissimilar. They're quite different. And as the stories are being shared, you can see the brain activity sort of syncing up. And at the end, it almost kind of becomes one and the same. And what they found with this is that effectively when we share stories, we can control the way that people feel and the way that people act. And that's because there is a nuclear almond shape in our prefrontal cortex called amygdala. And that controls and dictates our behaviors, our emotions. And one thing that triggers out are stories. So stories trumps pretty much anything else when it comes down to trying to convey, convince, enroll, engage your audience. It's the reason why, if you've ever seen politicians on the run up to elections, so there's primaries are going to be happening in the US pretty soon. We're going to have elections in the UK. They usually, they won't say something like 70% of Britons are currently struggling to make ends meet, and they might say a question like, I was up in a town outside of Manchester, and I met Pete, and he's a plumber. And Pete, and he goes into they go into these stories, right? She goes into these stories, and it's because we remember those stories, we remember the individual. In fact, there's a study that was made in terms of nonprofit and charity sector, and they looked at the difference between the likelihood of people donating to a group or a cause versus an individual. And what they found is that it is way more likely that you are going to donate to an individual story that you hear about someone. For example, when I was country manager at the Movember Foundation, I would talk about the great work that we did at Movember, but I would always use specific stories. So I would say a story of like a Mo Bros. That's the name that we used to give to people taking part in Mo Sisters. But I would give a story about Mo Bro, and I would be very specific about that story. And that just makes it more emotional. It makes it more tangible and more relatable. And I think, as you know, what we try and do, I guess, as leaders is, how do we get people to know, like, and trust us as quickly as possible in a genuine and authentic way, not necessarily. I know it sounds quite manipulative and it sounds quite transactional, but it's just maximizing the tools you have available to land your message.
Okay. So what I'm hearing from that is sort of two things. The first is that stories are very primitive. They've been around for a long time. And because of that, we have an innate connection with stories. And then the second thing is that there is actually scientific evidence to suggest that our brain chemistry changes when we hear stories, right?
Can I do a live example?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So for those who are listening to this but not watching, I'm holding a sort of a mouse with a cape and an eye mask. So Matt, how much do you think this is worth?
£10.
£10. Okay. Now, what if I told you that during the Second World War, my great-grandfather, called Pierre La Renaudie, was one of the leaders of the resistance in central France in a place called Corrèze. And he was actually arrested by Nazi Germans and was sent over to working camps across Germany. And before he left, he managed to get this from my grandmother, his daughter. He only had one daughter, my grandmother. And this used to be in a cot. And he took it with him and he managed to sew it into his jacket and kept it the entire trip and entire time he was out there. When he came back, he gave it back to my grandmother and he made her to promise that she would give this to whoever in her family would end up starting a business, because he actually ended up being an entrepreneur. And so my grandmother gave me this. How much do you think this is worth now?
I guess to you, it's worth a lot.
Yeah. What's changed?
The emotional connection you have to that item.
Yeah, but it's the story. That's it. It's the same thing. You can do this with a pen. You can do this with and it's the same with our products and services. I think what happens is, they did a study. There was a social kind of anthropologist experiment they did called the insignificant object. I talk about this in the book. All this stuff, by the way, is in the book. But what they took is that they took really insignificant objects, so thrift shopped objects. We're talking like trinkets and just horrible little things. And they paired them up with copywriters and writers, and they wrote a fictional story about this item. And then they listed it on eBay. What they wanted to see was, would pairing up an insignificant object with an emotionally charged story, a fictional story, significantly increase the value of the object? Now, I think they more or less bought about $1.25 per item. They bought in total $189, I think, worth of items. And anything they'd sell, they'd split between the authors and the charity, right? And they sold for a whooping $8,000, right? And so it was 61x return, basically, on this initiative. And what they found is that the more emotionally invested we are, the less resistant and critical we become. It's sort of why you see people queue up for the latest drop of an iPhone or this latest fashion clothes kind of shoe or t-shirt or whatever. It's because when we are emotionally invested into a story, into a narrative, we are less likely to be judgmental and critical.
That makes total sense. if I'm listening to this, I'm a studio owner. I'm busy designing logos, building brands for people. Maybe I'm quite good at doing this for other people. Like I'm quite good at finding the narratives of brands,
Mhm.
but I'm not very good at doing this for myself, or don't like how do I apply this to my business and connecting with people and finding clients?
So I actually remember you brought me into one of your mastermind kind of group things years ago. And I remember doing this exercise live with one of the participants. I don't know if you remember this.
I do, yeah.
One of the one of the guys who was running an agency, I think he was like a brand designer, website logo design, something like that. Like that's what they used to do. Brand marketing, I forgot. And I just asked him, so I was like, to tell me about like when was your first like memory of you coming across this concept of like art or creativity or whatever. And he said, well, my dad was a photographer. And one day he took me to a studio and he walks into the studio and he sees like all these kind of busy creatives around doing lots of different stuff. And he was like, thought it was really exciting. But this one particular thing really drew his attention. And it was this guy on this iMac. I think it was like one of the original iMacs. And he looked at this computer and he was like, whoa, like, what is this? But what he focused on and honed in on was this mouse. Like he'd never seen this mouse. And it was like this little mouse that he was moving around and he thought it was just beautifully designed. And he remembers like the impact he had of seeing this object and just how magical it felt. And as he was telling the story, I was like, well, that's interesting because what you help people do is create a brand image where people feel the same thing that you felt the first time you saw that mouse. And he was like, oh yeah. And so he started using that story. And instead of sort of going, we're a brand marketing design agency and just, he would actually say, one of the things that we realize is that people don't just want a logo. People want people to feel a certain emotion when they interact with the logo. Well, I first discovered that when I was 6 years old when my dad took me, and he would share this story. And so suddenly you become not just a creative agency owner, or you don't become just a branding design agency. You become an agency with a story. And by definition, you will stick into someone's mind differently than any other agencies. In fact, it's interesting because Patagonia, I don't know if you've seen this, have just released a campaign called it's something like "Fashion is none of a business." Fashion is none of our business. Have you seen that?
No.
It's amazing. It's basically they did a whole campaign about what they don't stand for. That's a story, right? A story where they're basically saying, we don't care that our things don't look super fashionable and it's not going to be for everybody. And we believe to build things that are going to last forever. And that's our job, to save our home planet. That's why we're in business. Well, they're not going to attract everyone. But that's the thing. I think when you have that capacity and clarity around what you stand for, you can tell stories to wrap them up. So Amanda Baker calls them the 5 stories. I call them, 4 or 5 stories in my book. But it's basically the same concept. It's like there are different types of stories that you can learn how to unpack. There's your origin story, your signature story, your personal story, which is kind of like, if you think about typically when you were younger, there are some elements in your life that drew you toward doing this work. So I talk about that in the book, The River of Life, all that kind of stuff, the source, shape, and share. Then you've got the business story. So like, why did you actually start this business, this particular company? How did it come about? So sometimes someone will say, well, I used to work in this agency and I was really frustrated the way that people were billing clients or the way that people were just churning out all these logos with no soul. And I wanted to work with meaningful clients and actually get paid well and do work I love. And, so whatever that story is. Then you got the product and service story, which is kind of like you explain why you developed this product. So for example, on the back of launching my book, Glow in the Dark, a lot of people ask me, like, how do you actually implement this? So I launched, Own Your Story program, which I know you've been on as well. So, it's that kind of ability to help people actually unpack and share their stories. That's the product and service story. And then you've got the client story. So you can find of customers, right? So I can think about, imagine in this context, I might say, well, this CEO came up to me and she used to really struggle to show more of herself in public. And she had a very kind of forward-facing role as the CEO of a company. And she was being asked to speak more on stages, to be more in podcasts. And she just wasn't connecting because she knew she was really playing it safe and keeping a distance and putting up a mask. She knew deep down she had a story worth sharing. She was terrified of sharing it. She didn't know how to share it in a business or professional context. And so through the process of working together, we then got to a stage where she felt comfortable and confident in her ability to convey a story in a powerful way. And she started little by little, it took some time, but sharing her story in a more public way. And it just completely like transformed her business and her ability to convert and engage her potential customers, especially when she was doing these sort of consultation calls or webinars, that kind of stuff. And then the final one is you've got your kind of vision story. It's kind of you paint a picture of the world you paint the picture of a future worth striving for. So this is kind of like, if you think this is just about a logo, you're kind of mistaken. It's a bit what like Dan, talks about, like Daniel Priestley. But it's this ability to paint a picture, tell a story of like, well, if we manage to live in a world where our problem was solved, this is what it would look like, and this is why it's worth fighting for. So these are just like 5 tangible stories that you can apply to your business. Most people haven't taken the time to unpack their story, and it's crazy to me because I always say if you knew how powerful your story was, you wouldn't be sitting on it. But it's also for your team. So take Movember, for example, right? So when I joined Movember in 2012, I was tasked with launching the foundation across some European countries and growing it in established countries in Europe. And all I had was like a backpack, a very questionable mustache, and a story. And at first, it wasn't my story. It was the story of the founders. I had to tell the story of how these 2 mates met up in a bar. They bumped into each other at a skate competition. They met up in a bar. This guy walks in with a Maroney's t-shirt with a mustache, and they kind of go, "What happened to the mustache?" Like it was such iconic, like our sports, like icons when we were kids, and heroes and dads and granddads used to rock mustaches. Like what happened? And they made a joke about how they would bring the mustache back to, and they did that, and then the rest is history. And they started Movember. But I would share their story. Eventually, I started sharing my personal story as to why I joined Movember, why I wanted to launch the foundation, and linking my personal story to the organizational story and also its purpose and mission was just a recipe for like success. I went on to raise 2.8 million euros with our team, got 110,000 people to sign up, won a bunch of awards along the way.
I totally get everything that you're saying. And I think it's clear that stories can be powerful. And I think you've given lots of examples of where stories can be powerful. Those 5 elements, one of those elements was client stories. And I'm always looking for what's the 80-20. So we're talking about the principle of story. What's the 20% that's going to make 80% of difference? And when I see creative agency owners talking about their work, they just talk about their work. Here's a campaign we did for Joe, and it was amazing. And here are some amazing images. And I know that a quick win for a lot of people listening to this would just be to swap campaign, whatever you're doing to showcase who you've worked with, portfolio with client stories. That could be a really powerful switch for a lot of people. So if I'm going to do that, if I'm the kind of agency that's got an amazing show reel, I've got all of these awards, I've got all these amazing clients, but every time I showcase something, I'm showcasing the end product. Where do I start from switching that into really powerful customer stories that will attract more of those kind of clients?
You break down story really simply. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. Or if you want, there's a setup, a conflict, a resolution. So keep that in mind and then filter everything you go through that. I developed a 3-step process in my book called the 3 C's, the context, connection, conclusion. You can use that. But I think what you want to do is you kind of paint us a picture of what was going on before. I'll give an example now. I'll break it down. So I'll say Matt was getting traction in his business, and he was growing, maybe not growing at the pace he wanted to, but he was getting some traction in, and he knew that doing live events mattered and getting on podcasts mattered, and he started doing those, but they just weren't converting. And one of the feelings he kept on feeling at the end of it was like, I hear these leaders kind of sharing the stories in a really powerful way, and I know I've got a story, but I think I'm just giving too much information. I'm not sure if I'm using the best parts of my story to really land the message and connect with my audience. Like I'm not 100% sure. What Matt was experiencing is what most people experience in that position, which is you're just too close to your story. It's really difficult to understand which parts are relevant to our target market. So all we did is we got Matt to sort of share his story. We kind of dived deep into the background. We started mapping out all the different elements. Some of them were actually completely irrelevant to his target. They were interesting, but they were irrelevant. They weren't helping his clients see how he could help them transform and win the day. And so what we did is instead we focused on an emotionally charged part of his story that really linked to the work that he did and why he did it. And then we helped him share it in a really simple way, really three-part structure of how he could share his story. And he could share the story, whether that's on a webinar, whether that was on a podcast when he's being introduced, whether that's on stage when he's talking, or a prospective client when he's talking to get them on board on his amazing community and group. And what happened is that Matt completely transformed the way that he engaged and connected. He no longer started off by basically listing his Wikipedia page or like his CV and like telling how amazing he was. Instead, he shared stories of how the work he did mattered, and then he, more than that, he got really excited about sharing the stories of his clients, and he applied the same principle but for his clients. And since then, Matt's gone on to many podcasts, influential podcasts. He's grown his business and yada yada yada. Do you see what I'm saying? So that I'm not the hero. I'm not positioning myself in the hero as I'm telling the story. You just know that I was able to help Matt. For creative people here, you can take a piece of paper or an iPad or whatever you're using, a tablet. And on the left side, you can do an island, right? Do a little island. I'm not going to draw it because I'm a terrible artist, but like island A, okay? And then you've got on the right side, you've got island B. Island A, you can make an unhappy smiley face. And on the island B, you can put a smiley face. Think about your customer as a journey. What were they going through? What was they experiencing? What was their reality? What were their frustration? What were their pains? What were their symptoms? All that on the left. And on the right, you put like what happened as a result of you working with them. They had clarity about their brand values. They had like these super amazing assets that they could put on social media. They had a whole campaign. They had a great ad, like whatever it was. Okay. That's your before and after picture. And so if you think about storytelling, that's your beginning and that's your end. The middle is the transformational process that you took them on. So whether that's your product, your service, your process, your methodology, whatever it is, right?
Makes 100% sense. When we've been through this process with our clients in the past, one of the first things they'll say is, I've got no idea what they were struggling with. They just came to us and they said, hey, we want to rebrand. And we said, sure, we can help with that. And then we got down into the weeds of the rebrand. So people are so detached in the creative space from what's going on in the client's world and what the client really wants and what their challenges are, for the most part, that they actually really even struggle with that. So if I'm an agency owner and I've had all these amazing clients, I've probably won some awards, I've got a really great portfolio, where would I start? If we're just talking about that island A, what are some ways that I could get some of that information and maybe even turn some of those client case studies into more powerful, compelling stories?
Future-proofing and reverse engineering, okay? So future-proofing is when you go through an intake with a potential customer, you're a client, you really just want to get clear on what the pain points are. So kind of if they say to you, we need a rebrand, and you go like, cool, like why? Like what is it about your current brand that you don't like? Oh, I just feel like it's really outdated. It doesn't represent our values anymore. People are saying that we look blah, 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 whatever. We've had it for the last 20 years or 5 years. We got it on the cheap. Okay, cool. And how does that making you feel? Like, oh, frustrated, blah, 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 I feel jealous. Like, and you just keep digging for what is the emotional cost of them not doing this rebrand or not working with you? Because it's quite difficult to paint a picture for future like stories around your customers, but also to maybe justify some of the investment that it's going to be to work with you, because it's going to have some sort of level of cost for them to kind of justify that investment. So that's one of them. Like if you could go back, if you could go for future conversations, have that. Now you can absolutely go back to clients. I've done that. And you kind of go, hey, do you mind if we just jump on a 10-15 minute call? We're just going through this process that we're working on to kind of clarify some of our own story. And we've been doing it for clients, and super easy for clients, and we're finding it quite challenging for ourselves, which is ironic, but it'd be great if you could jump on a 10-15 minutes. I'm just going to ask you a couple of questions that would really help us out. And if you've got any questions about like your current brand, very happy to answer that, as to say thanks or whatever. Then you jump on a call with them and you just say, hey, before you met us, like what was going on? And like, oh, like every time I logged onto my website, I felt dread, Anytime I had to send out a marketing campaign, I just thought like, it looks crap, whatever. You can reverse dig into like what was going on. And the very important thing here, where most people go wrong, is that they think they need to talk like it's a marketing brochure. And they come up with these really big fancy words, and copywriters might write these great sentences. But truly effective marketing, the way that you connect with someone is by making someone feel seen, heard, and understood. And nothing beats that better than repeating verbatim words that you hear of people describing their pain. So for example, let's say, you might used to think, oh, I work with award-winning creatives, okay? And you might realize that nobody calls themselves, oh, hi, I'm an award-winning creative. Someone might say, I'm the owner of an agency, or I run a small creative agency that's won a couple of awards. So you would then say, hey, if you run a small creative agency and you won a few awards and you're experiencing X, like, I want to talk to you. So by using verbatim, so I would usually either record the conversation or at least write down verbatim some of the pain points that they describe. If you do that, you're probably going to be ahead of the pack more than you know. The other thing that you can do is that if you want to record testimonials, so this can sound weird, but it works. There's two things. If you're asking for testimonials from clients, whether it's written or you do a video, there's two things you can go about it. One of them is you can go, hey, can you just provide a testimonial? And they're going to write something, and it might be the S word. Crap. I'll keep it.
You can swear on this podcast. Okay, you got free reign.
So it might be shit, right? It might just be shit, and you'll be like, oh crap. You know what I do? What I do instead now is I actually write a sort of like, hey, here's the kind of the structure that'd be really great in terms of feedback. So what's the problem that you were struggling with? What was different about the way that we worked? What was the transformation you experienced as a result of working with us? What do you love about having worked with us? And what would you say to someone thinking about working with us? And they're going to answer those questions. And then you can, if you want, summarize that into like a paragraph, and you send it back to them and say, hey, what I'm hearing is this. Would that be okay if we use that? And they're like, yeah. It's not being inauthentic or cheating. You're helping, because what you're thinking about is the barrier entry. So if people don't have time, I'll give you an example. I just gave a session. I just spoke at Nike at the headquarters in for a leadership summit they did a week or so ago at the time of recording this. And I'm trying to get a testimonial. On the day I actually spoke to my client contact, and I said, hey, would it be okay for you to provide a testimonial for my session? Because it really helps for future clients looking to book keynote speakers. And she was like, yes, of course. So I've sent her a couple of emails to chase her. My third email, you can be sure that it's going to be a pre-written text that I'm going to write for her and say, does this sound okay? Or would you add or change anything?
I can almost guarantee 80% of people listening to this podcast, this is not how they think. And they are so concerned with just like, is the client happy? Yeah, they're happy. Great. Where's our next client coming from? Most people aren't having like a debrief process. And most people aren't even tracking the tangible ROI or impact of their work. They're thinking, wow, I made a great logo. I created an amazing film. I did an amazing animation. I'm going to put that on my portfolio and say, this animation was for this amazing company. And what me and you know is like, that's great. But once you get to a certain level, every other creative has that. Every other creative has top clients. They have Nike, they have Unilever, they have all of these clients. Like, that is not distinguishing you from the competition. People at that level, when they're spending that kind of money, they want to know, okay, when I invest 100 grand with you, what am I going to get in return from a tangible perspective? And I know sometimes like quantifying these things can be hard, but this is where I think story comes in. And this is where I think that process comes in.
100%. I think what you're referring to without saying it, and I think that's what you're kind of referring to, there's this storytelling framework that Donald Miller created from the book Building a Story Brand. And he's effectively taken the 12 stages of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey and distilled them into 7 steps applicable for businesses. But I'm not going to get into all the 7 steps because people can look it up. But there is a point where there's like a protagonist. They want something gets in the way. They meet a guide. And the guide has a plan and calls them to action, and either they result into success or they result into failure. That's kind of like the premise of every story. It's the premise of every story that you should talk about when you talk about your customer and business. But the reason I bring this up is that the guide needs 2 things. The guide needs credibility or authority and empathy. You need those 2 things. And so if you say you've worked with Nike, Unilever, Google's, whatever, that's credibility, that's authority, right? But it doesn't give you the extra edge where you have to have empathy. Empathy is the ability to say to someone like, I know what it feels like to look at these different service providers and think, I'm about to drop $1 million on a campaign. And if I get this wrong, this is what people need to understand. And I hope this lands with you, and you can tell me if it doesn't. I realized at some point on my journey as a professional speaker that when companies were bringing me in to speak at their events, especially all staff events or their leadership summits, that kind of stuff, what they're risking wasn't my high speaker fee. What they were risking was their reputation. And I think a lot of people need to understand this, that when you're pitching like high sort of ticket products or services to clients, what they are thinking about is, am I going to look like an idiot when they deliver the final product? or am I going to look like a rock star because I got the right service providers? And that is a high stakes, stressful environment for people to be in. So your job, when you're telling a story, it's to not just tell them we can do this, but it's we get you, and we know what it takes. And yes, every project might be different. Yes, we work with all these things, but it's just to make them feel seen, heard, and understood. And for that, you need empathy.
Okay, amazing. That's a really clear and valuable point. So my next question is going to be, how do we do that? Because I think creatives are great at building credibility. How do I build empathy? How do I get them to feel like I see them and I know them and I get them?
Well, I said it earlier. You use the same words that they use to describe their pain points. Like if you join my newsletter, I get a lot of emails sometimes saying like, "Get out of my head, stop being in my head." I mean, my target audience are typically CEOs and founders of organizations who want to learn how to better connect with their audience, build trust, inspire change, and that's kind of like my target market. And so I know a lot of the frustrations that come with this idea that you've got this big vision that is really difficult to fulfill, that you're not getting your people aligned, or you're finding it difficult to get your customers or clients to really see what you see and connect, all this kind of stuff. So I can speak to those challenges with intrinsic details. And that's how you build empathy. I would say if you're creative, you're probably driven by some sort of creative process. Maybe you gamify this process and you kind of think about what are some of the common words being used or associated with describing my customer's pain points. And you start, as a team figuring out, hey, any call you have with someone, any email you get, any question you get on social media, start tracking what are some of the words, the questions that people ask. And really, that's all it is. You then just sort of regurgitate saying, I'll use you as an example again. So, when you came to me, you were kind of like, look, I know I've got this story, and there's just all these different parts of my story. I'm just not sure anymore if it's relevant, if it's resonating, all this kind of stuff, right? Would that be an accurate description of how you felt?
Yeah.
Yeah. So loads of people feel the same way. So I can describe that about you, but next time I talk with a prospective client, I can say the exact same story. And they'll be like, oh yeah, totally. And there's nothing worse than stepping off a stage or getting off a podcast and going, I bottle that. That was, I just waffled the answer. I spoke for, whatever it was. So you just describe that. That's all it is. Stand-up comedians, right, are really good at connecting with an audience, and they've got to do it really fast. So they're great teachers to look at in terms of what it takes to connect with people. And the reason why I say this is they'll say things that we can all relate to. So I'm following this dad on Instagram. I forgot his name now. I feel bad. I should give him credit, but he does these videos of him and his kids of like saying that he would never do two different meals for his kids, and then he ends up being basically a waiter for his kids. Like, oh, you don't like your toast being cut in heart shapes? I'm so sorry. Let me go and change that for you. But I laugh because that's so true, and I can see myself in that. Your job isn't to make your client laugh. Your job is to make your client feel seen.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. And I think this emphasizes the importance of having a structured sales process, right? And having a structured sales conversation. And before, it's so funny because when these AI note takers came out, we started using it for our calls. And everyone was like, oh, what's this thing that you're doing? And we started saying to everyone, look, we really highly recommend that you use these note takers and you record it, and we start taking them through this process. Now, when we have client calls, we have like 20 note takers joining our group calls. And people are starting to get it. But I think up until now, it's always been about the end product and what that person is getting, rather than the pain points, the frustrations, the desires, and all of that kind of stuff.
A really quick way that I found to integrate AI note taking in prospective client calls is you can either say it ahead of the time, or you can send the course like, hey, is that okay if I let my note taker in so that I can focus on our conversation and not have to be busy taking notes? And I'm very happy to share you the summary of what we talked about today. Would that be helpful? And they're like, yeah. And then you got it. And then you, because that is also about connection, by the way. It's about getting the permission. Like I think it can be a bit off-putting if you jump on a call and it's recorded and there's an AI and you do and no one mentions it. It's just a bit bizarre. So I think just name it, whether that's ahead of the time or on the call, just a really quick sentence, and then you're off.
Yeah, I love it. Great tip. Let's talk a little bit about the business story and the origin story, because I think the client story I get now, and people will have to go back and listen if they want those 5 questions for the testimonial.
Mm.
But how do I go about sharing my story as the founder of this creative business? Where do I start? Is it social media? Am I doing that before I jump on client calls?
So, I mean, the first thing you need to do is you need to do the work. So, in my book, Glow in the Dark, that is very much the premise of the book, is kind of like how sharing your personal story can transform your business and change your life. So you've got to first do the work, and the very short version of it is that, and that there's some templates that you get in the book and that kind of stuff. But it's the first exercise is called the River of Life, and that the idea is that you map out your professional and personal life from birth to date, and you can separate it into decades. You kind of go the highs, the lows. What were some of the significant moments that shaped those decades? What were some of the heartbreaks, or some of the wins? What some of the losses, the failures, the wins, like the successes, that kind of stuff? You map it all out, and it sounds really weird at first, but you must do this without any intention of sharing any of it. Because otherwise, what's going to happen is that you're going to keep on trying to force, like, how is this linked to my business? How is that linked to my business? Like when we did that exercise with your group, and I spoke to that guy about that mouse, he had never thought a single second that story would ever be connected to his business. And that's the point. You've got to go through these events. The metaphor I use in the book, it's kind of like it's like a pantry, right? So if you want to make a meal and you don't know what you've got in your pantry, you've got to get everything out, see what's out of date, see what's still good, see what matches together, and then you can make this extraordinary meal. But in order to do that, you need to see what's there. So the first step is really what I would say source. It's mapping it out. You've got different exercises. You've got also the time machine, which is go back in time. If there were 3 moments in time, you could go back and talk to yourself and give yourself a piece of advice. When would it be? What would you say? Those can sometimes be some of the helpful tips. So you kind of map that out. Then you might go, okay, Mark, I've got like a few random stories, but I don't really see how these match, right? Well, actually, I remember when I was the mentor and profile for Daniel Priestley, I was doing this session, and I remember this guy chatting, right? And he, if I remember correctly, his job was doing real estate development for students, and it was all about creating really healthy, wellness kind of focused student accommodation for universities and towns. And he didn't really see like he had anything in his origin story. We started talking, and when he was younger, his dad died at a young age when he was a kid, and him and his, I think, two brothers and his mum ended up moving back north, closer to her family, and it was like really challenging. Like their lifestyle completely changed dramatically from one day to the next. He was kind of bullied at school. He struggled. He was acting out, all this kind of stuff. And he realized that the reason why he does what he does today was because he wants people to feel at home, wherever home is. And home should also be when you're away from home. And that, like, when you had this aha moment, it kind of blew me away. But he would have never linked those two stories until he actually went through the process, right? Until he actually went through mapping out. Then once you've kind of think about maybe a potential story, and this is where people are going to be like, great, Mark, I just want the secret pill. But I'm afraid to tell you that your story sharpens as you share it. I mean, you know this. So you might have 2-3 potential stories, right? You're not sure. Like this story about that might be linked. Maybe this one, I'm not quite sure. What you then do is you might take one of the stories, maybe take 3 of the stories, and then you apply the 3 steps process, which is context, connection, conclusion. Effectively, beginning, middle, and end, or setup, conflict, resolution. You just say, for example, me, okay? I'm 10 days out of giving my TEDx talk, and I've just spent the last 21 days practicing my talk with my friends, and every single time I feel a little bit more dead inside. So that's like the setup, right? Then you go into the connection. In 10 days' time, I'm stepping on stage in what could be one of the most viewed talks of my life, and I'm either going to crash and burn or can hopefully inspire and change the world in a small kind of way. And with 10 days, I literally decide to ditch my entire talk and start from scratch. And instead of hiding, I want to talk about something that's true and honest. And instead of pretending, I want to be raw and real. And then you go into conclusion. Conclusion is the final piece of the puzzle where you land the plane. And this might say, I ended up going on stage and sharing the story about what I think entrepreneurship is. We've been lied to as entrepreneurs. That talk went on to be viewed at 1.2 million times. It became the most viewed TEDx talk, and Stephen Bartlett from the Diary of a CEO listed it as the number one TED talk entrepreneurs should watch. And the reason why I'm saying this is actually what most of us want to give as a talk that sounds great. What most of us need is give a talk that is real. And so that is just I just made this up on the spot, but that's like a simple formula that you can kind of follow. And then you have to practice sharing it. And here's what's going to happen. You're going to get uncomfortable because you're going to ask people. If someone comes up to you and goes, "That was really inspiring," and you go, "Oh, cool, thank you. What was inspiring? What part was inspiring?" And they're going to tell you the things that they hear. Pay attention to what sticks, to what people remember. And then you polish it. You take a leaf from stand-up comedians. I used to hang out with stand-up comedians in South Africa, like Trevor Noah, back in 2008. And what I saw them do is day in and day out, every day they'd practice, sometimes 2 different comedy clubs. They'd practice the same material and just sharpen it and make it better and ditch parts of it. And the things that got a laugh, they kept it. Things that got like a massive bomb, they got rid of it. It's the same thing with your story.
I know this might sound like a bit of cart before horse, but I know that there's a lot of people listening to this that get it, and maybe they're having some light bulb moments, but it sounds like a lot of work. And there's so many podcasts out there, and there's so many things that we're told that we should do as business owners. Like, you need to create content, you need to, I don't know, there's a million and one things, right? And there's a million and one videos out there. Why go through this process? Like, what does a powerful story really get you?
A powerful story is actually both selfish and selfless in a way. It changes the way that you show up in conversations, whether that's on the phone or in person. It shows the way that you show up on a podcast, on a stage, on social media, and in media. It is a complete unfair competitive advantage, because I actually would argue it's the only USP you have. This might pinch for people listening to this, especially with a Gen AI world that we're kind of entering, which is absolutely bananas. Most of your skill set up to a certain point can be replaced. There's very similar services that you can find around. The one thing that nobody can copy you on is your story. And actually, I think, when people were panicking about Gen AI coming, I was like, well, actually, the interesting thing is that we're going to see a huge increase in the importance of humanizing our work. So humanizing our leadership, humanizing our stories. So look, you just have to look at most of creators. Look, Christo, a friend of yours, right? I remember him saying, like, this video I think he did about how he started his YouTube channel when he was 40, I think, or something like that. And he just started getting traction when he was like 40 and in his 50s and that kind of stuff. And that is a personal story. It's kind of like, if you think you're too old, that you're too late, you're not. I mean, I started at 40. That is a story. And what stories do, it's like, man, it just cuts through the noise and it creates a bond. And I learned this, my first job out of uni, I used to interview politicians and business leaders around the world. I lived in a bunch of countries around the world, from Kazakhstan to South Africa to the Gambia, Cyprus, all that stuff. And as I was sitting down with them and sharing their stories, within an hour, we've created this intimacy. We created this bond, this connection that we actually used back then. That's why I've changed my life and my career. But it was a very manipulative technique to sell very expensive ads in newspapers. But what that made me realize is that you can use stories for good, you can use stories for bad. If you think about the world we live in today, one of the reasons why a lot of the countries are going to shit is because we're experiencing a narrative void. A narrative void is when you don't have a compelling enough story to latch on. And so you get onto whatever the next best story is. And in this particular case, it's often a story of fear, right? So look at what happens in situations where we use story for bad, i.e. for fear. So stories can be your secret weapon. Stories can be your USB. But they can also make it fun for anybody here who's listening, who hates sales, who just does not like the idea of having to like sell, that they were just like, hey, Mark, I just want to be able to have people to just say, here's the money, create the best work you can. Thank you. And never have to sell, never have to hunt, never have to make sales calls. Like, I get it. And at the same time, I want to tell you, like, story is a great way to get around that, because it doesn't feel like selling when you're sharing stories. You could call it story selling, but really it's this idea of like wrapping everything you do, the great work that you believe in, the values that you stand for, the clients that you've helped, and you share those in digestible, compelling stories.
Story selling. I love that term. And I think a lot of people will gravitate towards that because I know that creatives in general would love that. They would love their ideal clients knocking at their door saying, hey, how do we give you some money to help us with this campaign or this problem that we have? And I think that is one of the best routes to that, because I think the person that can tell the best story is the one that often gets the best clients, creates the best campaigns. It's everything that advertising and media is built on, right? And so why not apply it to our own business?
Sharing a powerful, compelling origin story shows that you care and that you're here for the long run, that you're not just here for like a quick buck. I was literally listening to a podcast this morning, and there's this human biohacker, right? Was being interviewed. And, I didn't feel any kind of emotional connection. I was interested in the content, but I didn't necessarily like the guy. And then he shared how he spent 20 years in this industry predicting people's deaths, and how he saw this one particular case where he saw that this guy had two different types of medication being prescribed, and those combination is a higher risk of heart failure. And he wanted to call the client, and he asked HR permission, and they said it's completely against the law. If you do that, we'll prosecute and sue you. And so he knew by not making that phone call that this guy was most likely going to die. And that weighed so much on his conscience that he decided to leave to start his own company where he would be able to advise the masses around some of the health, indicators that would help you to live a longer, better life. I mean, I'm butchering it, but now I know he cared. Like, I know why he started what he's doing,
Yeah. And that's very much the foundation of this piece, right? It's the why, the bigger purpose, why should we care part,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Why should I listen? Why should I pay
Yeah.
attention?
And I'm just curious, what's your why?
My why is to normalize the human condition. It's going to mean nothing to anybody else but me, and that's okay. It's effectively, not to get down the sub story, but I grew up in an environment where I was made wrong pretty much on a daily basis because I'm dyslexic. I've got ADD. I come from a dual heritage background. We spoke a different language at home that we did outside. And my teachers used to bully me and humiliate me on a regular basis because I couldn't spell, couldn't read out loud, couldn't do simple maths. And so I felt like shit, to be perfectly honest. And I discovered that when I was on stage, because my mom was a school teacher and she used to put plays for kids to experience that thespian art, and she used to put me on like back dance or like a flower pot or whatever. When I was on stage, I just came alive. And I remember this one particular story when I was 8 years old. She put me on in Bugsy Malone. I was a ventriloquist puppet. I didn't even speak, right? He was just carrying me around the stage, and it was kind of like going like this. And everybody was laughing, and I wasn't even using words, but I could connect with people in a way that I'd never been able to connect in a classroom. People lined up to me to kind of say, like, you should be an actor. And I got praised for the first time by adults, right? When I was about 8 years old. And so because of that, I know what it feels like to feel like you don't have a voice, to feel like you're frustrated because you're being overseen for your potential. And so I've since, I think, in many different ways, tried to create spaces, environments, products, services, conversation, stories around making people feel seen, heard, and understood. And that's why my why is to normalize the human condition, because I think if we feel seen, heard, and understood, we can then go and focus and do the great work we're meant to do.
If that's not an example of the power of story, then I don't know what is. Dude, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Where can people grab the book? Where can they dive more into these ideas and this content?
The central website where most people go to, especially to book me as a speaker, it's markleruste.com, markleruste.com. If you want to find out more about story, and if you want to get the free assessment and get the PDF report, you go to storycast.co. That's story and then cast.co. And if you want to buy the book anywhere, any bookshop, you can order it. It's on Amazon. It was published with Hachette UK, which, by the way, when I was being bullied as a kid because I couldn't spell and read out loud, the very textbooks that used to weigh my bag down and I used to dread to open up, that publisher's Hachette, it's one of the biggest publishers in the world, they published my book, Glow in the Dark. So full circle.
Love that, man. That's so cool. We'll put the link to all of those things in the show notes. If you want to find out about Mark, go to markleruste.com. Can people connect to you on social? What channels are you most active on?
LinkedIn. LinkedIn is the one that I'm most active on, and I just want to leave, not to leave like this sort of inspirational quote, but I really believe that there's two things. One of them is the story that will change your life isn't the story that you'll hear, it's the story that you'll share. And in the end, we all become stories when we die. So we might as well influence the way that our stories are told and the way they impact and serve others.
Amazing. Dude, thank you so much for being a guest. It's been an absolute pleasure. Before you leave, if you found this episode valuable, please hit the subscribe button. Also, if you are a creative business owner doing more than 10K a month and you want to grow and scale without working longer hours or hiring a massive team, then I have something you may be interested in. We have just developed a tool that will give you a custom growth strategy based on exactly where you are in your business right now. So you can stop consuming lots of random content and trying to figure things out on your own and actually get something personalized to you. You will also receive a free copy of my book, and it will point out relevant chapters. If you'd like to take the scorecard, it's totally free. You just have to click the link in the show notes or connect with me on LinkedIn, and you will see a link in my bio. Thanks for listening. This is the Creative Courage Podcast.